My brother smirked and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "They left you nothing. Figured it was time you learned responsibility." The will lay on the mahogany table like a death sentence. My mother sat beside him with dry eyes and a proud tilt to her chin, as if cruelty could be dressed up as wisdom. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, shuffling papers he didn't need to shuffle. His assistant stared at her notepad like she wished she could disappear. My hands went numb. The room shrank to the sound of my own breathing and the hollow echo of polite condolences nobody meant. I wanted to throw the nearest chair through the window. I wanted to laugh until I choked on it. I wanted to ask them how they could sit there with straight faces and call this justice. My name is Eloan Maris. I was 28 years old, and I had just been told I was worth nothing as a teaching moment. My father had died 3 weeks earlier. Heart attack in his study, quick and final. We hadn't been close, but I'd hoped, stupidly, desperately, that the end might bring some kind of acknowledgement, some sign that he'd seen me, even once. Instead, his will carved me out completely. Everything went to my brother Marcus. The house, the investments, the properties. I got a lesson in responsibility. I left the lawyer's office with nothing but a duffel bag and my father's old wool scarf. I'd grabbed it from his closet the day he died, before anyone thought to inventory his things. It still smelled like his cologne, sandalwood, and something sharper underneath. I hated that it comforted me. I hated that I wanted comfort from a man who'd just proven, even in death, that I meant nothing to him. Marcus drove me to the bus station in his black SUV. His hand on the steering wheel was steady, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror like he expected me to explode. Like he was waiting for the tantrum that would justify everything they'd done. "We'll protect the legacy," he said, like he was reciting a hymn he'd memorized for Sunday service. "That's what Dad wanted. You understand that, right? This isn't personal." I didn't answer. I watched the neighborhood pass through the window, each house holding a memory I'd never be allowed to claim. The tire swing in the Hendersons' yard, the corner where I'd learned to ride a bike, the mailbox I'd crashed into at 16, and how my father had yelled for an hour about responsibility. At the station, Marcus handed me $300 in cash like he was tipping a valet. "Call if you need anything," he said. We both knew I wouldn't. We both knew he wouldn't answer if I did. 2 days later, an attorney I'd never met called my cell phone. "Ms. Maris, my name is Patricia Vance. I represent your grandmother's separate estate. I need you to come to my office alone. There are documents that require your signature." My stomach flipped. Separate estate? I thought everything went through my father's will. "Not everything," she said, and something in her voice made me sit up straighter. "Your grandmother made additional arrangements, private ones. I think you'll want to see them in person." I took 3 buses to reach her office downtown, watching the city scroll past in a blur of gray and brown. The building was old but well kept, with brass fixtures and wood paneling that smelled like lemon polish. Ms. Vance was a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She didn't waste time with small talk or condolences. She handed me a single document, a codicil to my grandmother's original will, dated 2 years before her death. Her handwriting at the bottom was shaky but unmistakable, the same cursive she'd used on birthday cards my whole life. "She left specific instructions," Ms. Vance said quietly. "You're to be appointed steward of her properties, her charitable trusts, and her foundation funds. The transfer is conditional on your acceptance, but the terms are ironclad." I stared at the paper. She left me in charge of everything. "Everything your father thought he controlled," Ms. Vance said. "Yes." On the bus ride home, I remembered my grandmother's last visit. She'd been frail by then, using a walker to get around, but her mind was sharp as a scalpel. We sat on her porch drinking sweet tea while my parents argued inside about something I couldn't hear, probably money. It was always money with them, how to get more, how to keep it, how to make sure nobody else touched it. She'd lit a cigarette, which her doctor had forbidden, and passed it sideways to me like she was sharing a secret. Her eyes sparkled with mischief and something deeper, something sad. "Never assume the house is only one person's to hold," she'd whispered. "Your father thinks he inherited everything when I die. He'll inherit what I let him see. The rest is for someone who deserves it." At the time, I thought she was being cryptic the way old people sometimes are. Grandmothers say strange things when they're tired and their bodies are failing them. But now, holding her codicil in my coat pocket, her words felt less like a riddle and more like an assignment. She'd known what they would do. She'd known how they'd treat me when she was gone, when there was no one left to defend me. And she'd made sure I'd have the tools to fight back. Careful didn't mean passive, not anymore. The key was hidden inside an old Bible in my grandmother's study. Ms. Vance had given me legal access to the house, while Marcus and my mother argued over probate timelines with their expensive attorneys. I went at night, when I knew they'd be at dinner downtown celebrating their victory. The study smelled like lavender and dust and old paper, exactly how I remembered it from childhood visits. The safe was behind a painting of the Maine coastline, the one she'd bought on her honeymoon 60 years ago. Inside, I found a thin leather ledger with my grandmother's handwriting filling every page. Blue ink, precise letters, dates going back decades. Names, addresses, dollar amounts. Notes about tenants, scholarships, small grants to local artists and students who couldn't afford supplies. A foundation she'd run quietly for 30 years without ever putting her name on a building or demanding recognition. I flipped through pages of meticulous records. Debts forgiven for families facing hardship. Rent reduced during medical emergencies. Tuition paid for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and still came up short. This was the work my parents had bragged about at cocktail parties. The family legacy they'd toasted at holiday dinners and charity galas. But they hadn't done any of it. My grandmother had. Quietly, carefully, because the point was never the credit. Someone had been stewarding for decades. Now that someone was supposed to be me. Mrs. Medina opened her door and started crying the moment she saw my face. She'd rented the carriage house behind my grandmother's main property for 30 years. I found her name in the ledger with a note that said, "Reduced rent, loss leader bakery struggling, help through 2019 minimum." "Your grandmother saved my business," Mrs. Medina said, wiping her eyes with a faded dish towel. "When the economy crashed, I couldn't make rent for 4 months. I was going to lose everything I'd built. She told me not to worry about the money. She brought soup every week and left an envelope on my kitchen counter when she thought I wasn't looking." I sat in her small kitchen with its yellow curtains and hand-painted tiles, and I took notes while she talked. She told me about the other tenants in the building. The single mother in Unit 3 who'd lost her job during the pandemic, the veteran in Unit 7 who needed wheelchair modifications that insurance wouldn't cover. "Your father came by once," Mrs. Medina said carefully, watching my face. "After she passed, he said rent was going up 40%, market rates he called it, no exceptions." My stomach tightened into a knot. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd have to move, 30 years in this house, and I'd have to leave." She looked at me with wet, tired eyes. "Is that what you're here to tell me too?" "No," I said. "I'm here to fix it." My brother organized a family meeting at the main house to demonstrate control. I wasn't invited, but I showed up anyway with Ms. Vance's business card in my pocket and my grandmother's codicil memorized line by line. The look on Marcus's face when I walked through the front door was almost worth the 3-hour bus ride. "This is a private family discussion," he said, standing in the living room like he'd purchased it himself. "About estate management. You're not involved in that anymore." "About grandmother's properties." I kept my voice calm and level. "I have a legal interest in those. I'm named steward in her codicil." My mother's perfectly made-up eyes narrowed to slits. "What are you talking about? What codicil?" I didn't explain. I just sat down in my grandmother's favorite chair and watched them perform ownership like a rehearsed ceremony. Marcus talked loudly about responsibility and protecting family assets and fiduciary duty. My mother nodded at everything he said, adding comments about honoring your father's wishes. Then he announced plans to sell the cottage on Maple Street. The one where I'd spent every summer until I was 12. The one with the garden where my grandmother taught me to grow tomatoes and told me stories about her own childhood. "We've already got a buyer," Marcus said, smiling. "Cash offer, we close in 30 days. My throat closed. They expected no resistance. They'd spent my whole life underestimating me. They were about to learn what that cost. Mr. Calloway was a retired school principal whose name appeared on nearly every page of my grandmother's ledger. He'd served as a trustee on her foundation board for 20 years, handling scholarship selections and grant approvals. When I called him, my voice shaking slightly, he remembered me immediately. "Elowen," he said warmly. "Little Ellie who used to pick tomatoes with a leaner. I was wondering when you'd find the papers." We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those quiet places with mismatched furniture and jazz playing softly in the background. He was 73, with white hair and the calm demeanor of a man who'd spent decades managing difficult teenagers and angry parents. He listened without interrupting while I explained what had happened with my father's will, with the inheritance, with the so-called lesson in responsibility. "Your grandmother anticipated something like this," he said when I finished. "She loved your father, but she wasn't blind to his faults, or your mother's influence on him. She worried about what would happen to her work after she was gone." I showed him the codicil and copies from the ledger. He reviewed everything carefully, asking questions, making notes in a small spiral notebook. "I can help you file for provisional authority," he said finally. "The codicil is legitimate. Your grandmother made sure of that. She knew exactly what she was doing." A tiny legal hinge had turned. My brother's theater of control had its first crack. Late nights became my education. I spread my grandmother's records across my kitchen table and worked until my eyes burned and my coffee went cold. I transcribed invoices, scanned checks, annotated receipts with sticky notes color-coded by category. I built spreadsheets and timelines, cross-referencing every transaction I could find against bank statements and property records. Patterns emerged like shapes in fog. Payments routed through shell companies with generic names: Whitmore Holdings, Lakeside Consulting, Premier Property Group. Consulting fees to businesses that didn't seem to consult on anything. Invoices missing for work that had clearly been completed because I could see the new roof and the repaved driveway. The landscaping company had been paid twice for the same job 3 months apart. The accountant's fees had tripled in 2 years without any explanation in the minutes. Charitable donations that should have reached actual charities had been deposited into accounts I didn't recognize. The more I cataloged, the less the numbers matched the story my family told strangers at dinner parties and charity galas. My grandmother had built something real, a foundation that actually helped people, that kept families in their homes and kids in school and small businesses from going under. Someone had been hollowing it out from the inside, taking credit while stealing the substance. The question wasn't whether there was fraud. The question was how deep it went and who exactly was responsible. I had a feeling I already knew the answer. At a distant cousin's funeral, a relative I barely recognized pulled me aside near the coat rack. Her name was Diane, and she'd served on my grandmother's scholarship committee for 15 years. She glanced over her shoulder twice before speaking, like she was afraid of being overheard. "Your mother's been telling everyone she made the foundation possible," Diane said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That she handled everything after your grandmother got sick. But I was on the committee, Elowen. Your mother never came to a single meeting, not one. She didn't even know the recipients' names when they sent thank you cards." I kept my face neutral, but my heart was pounding. She's always been good at taking credit. Diane nodded vigorously. "There's more. Someone moved $40,000 last spring, called it an administrative fee for strategic restructuring. The committee never approved it. I asked questions, and your mother told me to mind my own business." She pressed a folded paper into my hand. "Receipt from the bank transfer. I made a copy because it didn't feel right." After she walked away, I unfolded the paper in the bathroom. The transfer had gone to a company called Whitmore Holdings. The same shell company I'd seen in the ledger. The confessions were starting to come. People talked once they realized someone was actually listening. Xavier Park had been my college roommate's boyfriend, a forensic accountant who loved financial puzzles more than he loved most people. He texted me out of nowhere one Tuesday night. "Heard through the grapevine you're digging into some estate irregularities. Need professional help. I'm between projects." We met at his apartment the next evening. The place looked like a server room had exploded inside a studio. 3 monitors on a standing desk, stacks of financial journals on every surface, a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and arrows that meant nothing to me but clearly told a story. I showed him everything I had: the ledger, the receipts, the mysterious bank transfer to Whitmore Holdings. He barely looked at me while I talked. His eyes were on the numbers, scanning, processing, connecting dots I couldn't see. Within an hour, he'd found discrepancies I'd missed entirely. Deposits that didn't match corresponding withdrawals. Invoices dated before the work was supposedly completed. A pattern of small transfers, always just under $10,000, that added up to significant amounts over time. "Someone's laundering generosity into lifestyle," he said, not looking up from his screen. "Taking money meant for charity and routing it to personal accounts through shell companies. It's actually pretty sophisticated, but it's not invisible." "Can you prove it?" "I can build a trail. Trails lead to people." He paused. "And people have lawyers." He turned his monitor toward me. The total made my stomach drop through the floor. My first foundation board meeting felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Mr. Calloway had arranged for me to attend as steward-in-waiting, a title that carried legal weight but felt paper-thin against the hostile stares around the table. The board members were polite on the surface, but guarded underneath. They knew who my family was. They knew whose side they were supposed to be on. I sat at the long mahogany table and listened to quarterly reports about grants, scholarships, and community programs. The executive director, a woman named Pamela who wouldn't meet my eyes, read numbers in a flat voice. Everything sounded fine on the surface, reasonable, responsible. Then I asked about last year's disbursements. The room went silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. One trustee, a man named Wallace who always sided with my mother, started shuffling papers like he'd lost something important. "We can certainly get you those records," he said, his voice too casual. "Everything's properly documented. It's just a matter of pulling the files." "I'd specifically like to see documentation for the Whitmore Holdings payment," I said calmly. $40,000 in administrative fees. What services were provided?" Wallace's face went pale. His hands stopped shuffling. "That was approved by the executive committee," he managed. "Which members specifically? I don't see minutes from that vote." Nobody answered. The silence was its own kind of confession. A local art dealer mentioned my grandmother's painting almost by accident. I'd stopped by his gallery to ask about appraising some pieces from her collection, part of my inventory process. He was a friendly man with paint-stained fingers who'd known my grandmother for 20 years. "Funny thing," he said, wrapping a small sculpture in brown paper. "That lighthouse watercolor she loved so much, the one that hung in her bedroom, it showed up at an estate sale last month. Your mother sold it privately back in June. Said she needed funds for emergency property repairs." I kept my face still. The lighthouse painting. Beautiful piece. She bought it from a student she'd helped put through art school. Had it for 40 years, maybe longer. I tracked down the sales slip that afternoon. The painting had sold for $8,000 to an LLC called Whitmore Holdings. The same Whitmore Holdings that received $40,000 in administrative fees. The same shell company that appeared nowhere in legitimate foundation records. I pulled property records through a public database. Whitmore Holdings was registered to a P.O. box in Nevada. The registered agent was a company that specialized in anonymous shell corporations. But the timing was wrong. The painting had sold 3 months before any repairs were discussed at board meetings. The emergency hadn't happened yet. My mother had sold my grandmother's favorite painting and pocketed the money. I asked my mother about the painting at Sunday dinner. She'd invited me to clear the air and move forward as a family, which meant she wanted to figure out how much I knew. I went because keeping enemies close felt smarter than keeping them curious, and because I wanted to watch her face when I asked the question. "The lighthouse watercolor," I said casually, cutting my chicken into precise squares. "The one from Grandma's bedroom, the one she bought from her student. Where did it end up?" My mother didn't flinch. Her fork never paused. "I sold it. The carriage house roof needed emergency repairs, and I didn't want to burden the foundation with personal property decisions. It seemed practical." "The roof repairs that happened in September." "That's right. But the painting sold in June, 3 months earlier." Her fork paused, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny hesitation that most people wouldn't notice. Then the smile returned, but colder around the edges. "I was planning ahead, being practical. You know how these things work when you're managing multiple properties." "I know the sale receipt shows Whitmore Holdings as the buyer. That name appears in some other transactions I've been reviewing." She set her fork down carefully. "Don't make this about money, Eloan. Your grandmother wouldn't want us fighting over material things. Grief isn't supposed to be an accounting ledger." Her dagger hid in sentiment, wrapped in family feelings and the memory of the dead. She thought I'd back down the way I always had. I smiled and finished my dinner. Alex Torres was an investigative journalist who'd made his career exposing local corruption. He'd covered embezzlement scandals at City Hall, fraud at a nonprofit hospital, bid rigging in the school district's construction contracts. His stories were meticulous, carefully sourced, and devastating when they landed. People went to prison because of Alex Torres. He emailed me on a Wednesday afternoon after someone. I suspected Mr. Calloway, passed him my name. "I'm hearing rumors about misappropriated charitable funds connected to a family foundation," he wrote. "Multiple sources pointing in the same direction. Wondering if you have documentation that might be relevant to public interest." I spent 2 hours preparing a carefully redacted packet, financial records with names removed, timelines showing discrepancies, the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Enough to establish a clear pattern without identifying specific individuals. I wasn't ready for names yet. I needed more. He called the next day, his voice thoughtful and precise. "This is significant," he said. "Real money diverted from real people. Scholarships that didn't get funded. Grants that disappeared. Tenants who paid fees for services they never received. This is exactly the kind of thing I cover." "Can you publish it?" "Not yet. I need more sourcing, on-the-record confirmations, documents I can authenticate. But I'm going to keep watching. These things take time to build properly, but when they land hard." The knowledge that someone credible was paying attention gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. A tenant's lease revealed the next piece of the puzzle. Mr. Okonkwo in Unit 4 had been paying monthly maintenance fees for 3 years, $200 on top of his rent, to cover building upkeep. Plumbing, electrical, roof repairs, landscaping. The fees were clearly documented in his lease agreement, countersigned by my brother as property manager. But when I contacted the plumber who'd serviced the building for over a decade, he told me he hadn't received direct payment since my grandmother's death. "I invoice the management company every month," he said, sounding tired and frustrated. "They keep saying the checks are coming, processing delays, accounting transitions. They never come. At this point, I'm owed over $6,000 for work I've already completed." The electrician told me the same story. So did the roofer who'd patched the carriage house last winter. 3 contractors, all owed money, all getting the same excuses. Tenants were paying maintenance fees. Contractors weren't getting paid. The money was going somewhere else entirely. I pulled bank records for the property management account through the provisional authority Ms. Vance had helped me establish. The maintenance fees had been transferred monthly to a sub-account labeled Family Events Fund. $200 a month from 4 occupied units for 3 years. Almost $30,000 total. My brother's explanation when I asked directly. Accounting errors during the transition. We're sorting it out. The same excuse, the same deflection. But numbers don't lie, and these numbers told a very clear story. Mr. Calloway called me at 7 in the morning, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Someone came to my house last night," he said without preamble. "A man I didn't recognize. He had cash in an envelope $5,000 in hundreds, and he wanted me to sign a document relinquishing my oversight authority on the foundation board. Immediate resignation, no questions asked." My blood went cold. I sat down on my kitchen floor because my legs wouldn't hold me. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to get off my property before I called the police. He left, but he knew things, Eloan. He knew about the audit requests I'd filed. He knew about our meetings and what we discussed. He knew about the Whitmore Holdings questions." "Did you recognize him at all?" "No, but someone is feeding your family information. Someone on the board or close to it. Someone who knows what we're finding and is scared of what comes next." My hands were trembling as I took notes. Someone had tried to buy his silence with cash. That meant they knew what they'd done was wrong. That meant they were actively trying to cover tracks and eliminate witnesses. That made them dangerous. But it also made them desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. I was counting on that. We filed a motion to freeze the foundation accounts, pending a full forensic audit. Xavier's documentation package was meticulous. Transfers to shell companies, missing invoices, fabricated receipts, the gap between fees collected and services actually paid for. Mr. Calloway provided a sworn trustee affidavit describing the attempted bribe. Ms. Vance filed in probate court under emergency provisions, arguing that assets were being actively dissipated. The judge reviewed everything for 2 days. Then she granted a temporary restraining order. I wasn't there when Marcus got the news, but I heard about it from 3 different sources within an hour. He slammed his hand on his car's steering wheel so hard he cracked the plastic dashboard. He called my phone 17 times in 2 hours, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails. I saved every single one. His final message was mostly cursing, but one line stood out. "You have no idea what you've done to this family. No idea what you've started." I knew exactly what I'd done. I'd stopped the bleeding. The restraining order meant they couldn't move money, sell properties, or liquidate any assets without explicit court approval. Their cash flow froze overnight. The sale of the Maple Street cottage was halted indefinitely. My brother's panic was making him sloppy. Sloppy people make mistakes that end up in evidence files. My mother tried damage control with the local newspaper. She gave an exclusive interview to the lifestyle section about the family's long tradition of charitable giving and community stewardship, complete with professional photos of her at fundraising galas, groundbreaking ceremonies, and ribbon-cutting events. She talked about scholarships she'd personally funded, community programs she'd developed and overseen, families she'd helped through difficult times. It was a masterpiece of self-promotion. It was also full of lies. Alex Torres called me that afternoon, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "She overplayed it," he said. "Badly. Half her quotes don't match bank records. She's claiming credit for donations that never actually cleared the foundation's accounts. Programs that were quietly defunded 2 years ago. Scholarships that went to one recipient instead of the 10 she's describing. She's lying in print. She's lying in print with her full name attached and photographs for identification. Public statements create public records, which create legal liability. Her boasts about specific programs give me specific things to fact-check." My mother had tried to control the narrative by getting ahead of the story. Instead, she'd handed us a roadmap of evidence. Her pride had become a paper trail. Her performance had become testimony. For someone who'd spent years telling me, I didn't understand how the real world worked. She'd made a remarkably stupid mistake. A property manager called with a disturbing complaint. My brother was trying to force out long-term tenants so he could list the building as vacant for a quick sale. Mrs. Medina was on the eviction list. So was the veteran in Unit 7 who used a wheelchair. The single mother in Unit 3 who worked double shifts to keep her kids in good schools. Mr. Okonkwo, who'd paid his rent faithfully for a decade. He's claiming the building needs major structural repairs that require vacancy, the manager told me over the phone. But I've seen the inspection reports. There's nothing wrong with that building that normal maintenance wouldn't fix. There's a restraining order on the accounts, I said. He can't actually close a sale. I know. That's why it doesn't make sense. Unless he's trying to create leverage for something else, or he just needs cash badly enough to take risks. The tenants organized themselves within a week. Mrs. Medina went door to door with a petition and a plate of cookies from her bakery. Mr. Okonkwo called every local news station that would listen. The veteran contacted his congressman's office about housing discrimination. Within 2 weeks, community voices had turned Marcus's quiet power play into a public controversy. The neighborhood association sent a formal letter of concern. A city councilwoman made a statement about protecting vulnerable renters. My brother had depended on silence and apathy to operate. He'd assumed tenants wouldn't fight back, that communities wouldn't organize, that working-class people he'd dismissed as unimportant wouldn't have voices that mattered. He was learning how wrong he'd been. Marcus filed a countersuit with maximum drama and minimum evidence. He claimed defamation, tortious interference with business relationships, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious manipulation of family estate proceedings. He hired a flashy attorney from the city who loved television cameras and dramatic press conferences on courthouse steps. My client is the victim of a calculated smear campaign, the lawyer announced to a cluster of reporters and photographers. A vindictive family member motivated by jealousy and greed, determined to destroy what generations have built. The irony was so thick, I nearly choked on it watching the evening news. Inside the courtroom, their strategy was pure intimidation. Loud objections to every question, personal attacks on my mental stability and motivations, implications that I'd forged documents, manipulated elderly trustees, and manufactured evidence to steal what rightfully belonged to my brother. I sat quietly at the defendant's table and answered every accusation with paper, transfer records, signed invoices with dates that didn't match claimed services, bank statements showing exactly where the money went and when. The judge wasn't stupid. She'd seen theatrical lawyers before. "Counsel," she said to Marcus's attorney, her voice flat with impatience, "if your client has actual evidence of defamation, present it. If not, stop wasting this court's time with performances." He didn't have evidence. I did. The hearing that changed everything came on a gray Thursday morning, when rain streaked the courtroom windows. Mr. Wallace, the trustee who'd always sided with my mother at every board meeting, took the witness stand. He'd been subpoenaed to explain the $40,000 Whitmore Holdings payment and his role in approving it. I expected him to lie under oath. I expected him to protect them the way he'd always protected them, to claim ignorance or pass blame downward to staff members who couldn't defend themselves. Instead, he looked at the judge and said, very quietly, "When I asked for documentation supporting that disbursement, I was given verbal assurances that paperwork would follow. I requested invoices and contracts 3 times over 2 months. I never received anything in writing." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the stenographer paused. "Did you personally authorize the payment?" the judge asked, leaning forward. "I was told it had been pre-approved by the executive committee and just needed my signature for processing. I believed what I was told because I'd never had reason not to trust the family." He paused, his voice dropping. "I shouldn't have believed them. I should have demanded documentation before signing anything." My brother's confident posture cracked visibly. My mother's carefully made-up face went white beneath her foundation. Mr. Wallace wasn't a hero. He'd enabled them for years by not asking hard questions. But when it came to perjury charges, he'd chosen self-preservation over misplaced loyalty. The judge ordered a full forensic audit with expanded scope and unlimited document access. The forensic audit was a blade that cut through everything they'd built. 37 pages of transactions, transfers, and discrepancies laid out in clinical precision with charts and timelines and account numbers. Xavier and his team had traced every single dollar, forward and backward, until the full picture emerged. Shell companies directly linked to my mother's personal accounts through shared signatories. Invoices fabricated for consulting work never performed by companies that didn't exist. Charitable donations recorded in board minutes but redirected to family expenditures before reaching any actual recipients. The $40,000 sent to Whitmore Holdings had been used to renovate my brother's vacation house in the mountains. My grandmother's lighthouse painting had been sold to a company my mother controlled, then resold at a private auction 3 months later for 3 times the price. The profit went to her personal account. Maintenance fees collected from tenants for 3 years had funded family vacations, country club dues, and a new car for Marcus's wife. Everything they'd bragged about, every gala, every groundbreaking ceremony, every self-congratulating speech about family legacy and community stewardship, had been built on money stolen from people who actually needed it. Alex Torres published his story 2 days after the audit was officially filed with the court. The headline ran above the fold: "Charitable foundation funds systematically diverted to family accounts." Donors withdrew pledges. Business partners issued statements of distance. The social invitations that defined my mother's life stopped coming. The consequences came like dominoes falling in slow motion, each one knocking down the next. 3 banks froze accounts connected to family members pending investigation. Trustees who'd been misled filed civil suits for breach of fiduciary duty. The state attorney general opened a formal investigation into nonprofit fraud and tax evasion. My brother's countersuit collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. His expensive attorney withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences in litigation strategy. His vacation house was seized as part of asset recovery proceedings. My mother's social circle evaporated like morning dew. The women she'd lunched with for decades stopped returning phone calls. The country club where she'd served on 3 committees quietly declined to renew her membership. The charity boards where she'd held leadership positions asked for her resignation. The neighbors I'd grown up with, the ones I'd always assumed were firmly on their side because they played tennis together and attended the same church, knocked on my apartment door one evening and said, "We're so sorry you had to find out like this. We had no idea what they were doing." I walked through my grandmother's house with legal papers in my hand and a set of new keys in my pocket. I felt neither triumph nor celebration, just a steady, exhausted relief that settled into my bones. I was not the person they'd tried to make me be. I was not worthless or irresponsible. I was not a cautionary tale about what happens to difficult daughters. I was the steward my grandmother had chosen, and I had work to do. I sat at my grandmother's desk with a cup of black coffee and her leather ledger open to the very first page she'd written 30 years ago. The morning light came through the window the way it always had, soft and golden, catching the dust motes that floated in the air. The room smelled like lavender and old books and furniture polish. Her photograph watched me from the shelf beside the window, that quiet smile, those knowing eyes that had seen exactly who her family was and planned accordingly. I'd spent 6 months restoring what had been stolen and rebuilding what had been broken. Scholarships were funded again, the full amounts reaching actual students. Mrs. Medina's rent was back to what my grandmother had charged, and her bakery was thriving. The contractors finally got paid for work they'd completed years ago. I organized community meetings to hear what people actually needed, appointed new trustees who asked hard questions and demanded documentation, established oversight procedures that would prevent this from ever happening again. The cottage on Maple Street was no longer for sale. The carriage house tenants had new leases with fair terms. The foundation was smaller now, more modest in scope, but it was honest. My brother moved out of state and stopped returning phone calls. My mother called once from a new number, her voice small and unfamiliar, asking if we could sit down and talk about healing as a family. I told her the truth as clearly as I could. Respect is something you practice over years. It's not something you get to demand after a lifetime of withholding it. Some relationships cannot be rebuilt. Some bridges burn down for good reasons, and the ashes make the ground more fertile for what comes next. I locked the study door and walked outside into the warm afternoon sunshine. The garden needed weeding. The tomato plants were ready to stake. There was work to do, not for recognition or revenge, not for my name on a plaque or my picture in a newspaper, but for the people my grandmother had trusted me to protect. That was enough. That was everything.